This is the Art of Darkness podcast with Kevin Kautzman.
And Brad Kelly. We're a couple of very online writers interested in the dark side of what drives creative people to create against all odds.
This show is about art and the people who make it, what it costs them, and what it takes to bring something unique and impactful into the world.
Each episode, we excavate the life and work of an artist you might think you know.
Don't worry, they're all safely dead.
On every episode, we try and find out just what the hell was wrong with them and how they worked through their darkness to create something that lives on after them and continues to move culture.
Find us online at artofdarkpod.com and on Twitter at artofdarkpod. We are back with another episode of Art of Darkness, the podcast about the dark side of creativity. I am Kevin Kautzman, joined as always. He's never missed an episode. Brad Kelly.
Thank you. Yeah. Hey, Kevin, how are you?
I'm great. You know, I like to think of you as the Ringo to my Paul. Brad. I love Ringo.
I don't even get George out of the deal. All right, fine.
Hey, listen. I came away because we are doing a core episode today on the life of the great, singular, brilliant John Lennon. And naturally, this episode is also going to be kind of a biography of the Beatles, although you could do an entire podcast about that alone and never exhaust content for the Beatles. In any case, Ringo, underrated. A human metronome.
Yeah.
Just incredible. I was watching Hard Day's Night, watching some of the footage. Absolutely incredible. Did you know where Ringo got his name?
No.
He gave himself a nickname because it's Richard Starkey, I think is his actual name. And he liked wearing rings. So he called himself Ringo.
Okay, man. Yeah. Why not?
Absolutely the best. And it's worth noting that a lot of the people that we're going to be talking about in this episode are still around. People have a lot of feelings about John Lennon. People have a lot of feelings about the Beatles.
Yes.
People increasingly have a lot of feelings about Art of Darkness. To a minuscule degree. And we love it. We love hearing from people. You can find us in the Telegram, t.me/artofdarkpod. We have an email, artofdarkpod@gmail.com. You have an opinion, you have thoughts, you have a request. You want us to cover somebody. We love hearing from our listeners.
Because John Lennon said that the Beatles were bigger than Jesus. We're bigger than maybe like a local pastor.
Hey now,
in a small town somewhere.
Hey now, I got skin in the game here, Brad. Brad's going to get me excommunicated. Well, and of course we will talk about John's statement there. Very interesting, situation that occurred. I'm going to turn the heat off in my house here on my phone. It's I've got a heat blowing. There was a lot of heat on John too.
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah. I don't remember it. I know of that.
Well, we'll talk about it. I mean, it was like a throwaway statement he made. I think it must have been around like 64, probably 65, I think, to some British reporter. And everybody's like, yeah, that's a shame. Because, of course, his meaning there was like, he was almost kind of lamenting it, right? Like, we're not, he wasn't boasting, he was saying, what has this culture become? He always struggled with being a Beatle. And we're going to talk a lot. Yeah,
it's one of those, I always think it as one of the misunderstood statements, like when Nietzsche says God is dead.
Yes, indeed. It's like, and of course, then a certain group of Americans took it literally, which we're inclined to do over here, and they're a little different over there. We'll get into it a little bit. I'm going to do my very best here. We've got about 5 hours, and for this and the After Dark, the material I'm using. Well, here let's kick it off. What do you know about John Lennon, Brad?
Lennon was a Russian revolutionary politician and political theorist. He served as the first and founding. Is this guy, right? First and founding head of government of
That's
Soviet...
a different podcast. That's a different. I am the walrus.
I am the walrus.
I am the walrus.
Shut up, Donnie.
You're like a child who walks in during the middle of a movie. No,
No,
that's the wrong John Lennon. What do you know
wrong,
about
wrong.
John Lennon?
John Lennon
John
is
Lennon of the
yeah,
Plastic Ono Band
yes, right. Best known for the Plastic
and
Ono band.
the Quarrymen.
Yeah, yes, yes. John Lennon, English. He was from I understand he's from a very working class background, Liverpool, I think. Um,
I,
Obviously,
it factors in slightly.
yeah, I'm
Yeah,
sure. I'm sure.
yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, obviously part of the Beatles, the amazing, Paul McCartney, John Lennon, dynamic, along with Ringo and George Harrison. Um, uh, as the Beatles became huge, and I'm always fascinated when I like read through Wikipedia to see how short the like Beatles land in America to like Beatles are a bunch of like stoned out freaks like just a couple years later making like clean cut but kind of edgy, slightly edgy when they come and then later they're like yeah,
The hair alone. So first,
yeah,
and we'll touch on all of this. And I'm going
yeah,
to try on this episode to be a little extemporaneous too, because there's
yeah,
so much material to cover.
yeah, yeah.
And I'm just going to do my very best. I'll show you what my markup of the principal biography I'm using looks like so you can
Mm.
understand what I'm dealing with. And I'll also, after we're done with what do you know here, I'll talk about my personal
Ah,
feelings and
okay.
connection a little
Yeah.
bit too. But one thing I hadn't realized is how huge Beatlemania was in Britain
Mm,
first.
mm.
I didn't quite hadn't made that connection. I mean, and they went
Makes
from,
sense.
and we'll touch on it, they went from playing like I think it was called the Cavern in Liverpool. They went literally like an underground venue, being
Mm,
mobbed to having a weekly television show in a matter of months, like from
mm.
Liverpool, famous in Liverpool to famous all number one in Britain
Right.
and the most popular group.
Yeah. And
And
then
just overnight. Hmm.
quickly the world, right?
Right. And
Yeah.
then
Yeah.
when they broke America, it
Yeah.
was
Huge.
there'd never been anything like it. And
Right.
actually we'll talk a lot about Brian Epstein, their
Mm.
manager, who, well, we'll get into it. What else do you
Yeah.
know about John? I got to
Yeah,
give
I
you a
mean, just
chance.
the
Yeah.
just the Be obviously the Beatles are huge, huge influence. Lennon became a significant public figure, looked to for wisdom and political guidance, and he became a sort of a messianic figure to some people, to some degree. Um, And then he was shot down outside of the Dakota Hotel, right? Is that
Yeah,
1980?
the Dakota building. I don't
Dakota
know if it was
building.
a hotel. They lived there.
The
Yeah.
Dakota. Yeah.
Yeah, the
It was that
Dakota.
1980, 1981.
1980.
Yeah, okay. But I know a little bit he had a relationship with Yoko Ono, which was sort of controversial and um there's a love-hate. It seems, I think people have there's a bit of a love-hate relationship with John Lennon, and I think there's one with Yoko Ono, and deservedly or so, it falls a little bit more into the hate than the love side of things. It's my understanding. Uh
We're going to talk about that. That's not
yeah.
really fair. If
Yeah,
you
I
want to
wouldn't think it
hate, if you
is,
want
but
to hate
yeah.
anything, we'll get into it. If you want to
Yeah.
hate anything coming out of this episode, obviously people have their politics. They have their very strong opinions about Lennon. A lot of people hate Imagine. The
Yeah.
Beatles are so overplayed, so iconic. They changed so many things.
Mhm.
People talk about whether were they a Tavistock creation? Were they a CIA psyop? We'll talk a little bit about that in the
Okay.
After Dark. We're not going to go
Excellent.
too deeply into that, but people have some really strong opinions.
Mhm.
And a lot of people it's just sort of seen as like basic.
Yeah.
And it is, but have you gone back and listened to Rubber Soul? Have you gone back
Mhm.
and listened to Revolver?
No, they're
Uh,
great.
and even the early stuff, it's just bonkers. And
Yeah.
the story is incredible. There's nothing
Yeah.
else like it in popular music.
Yeah.
Uh,
So I guess beyond that, I don't know a whole lot, really. I mean,
oh,
everything about him is sort of a feels like a deliberate presentation of a certain kind of figure. So as an actual individual, I don't know. I know there's sort of accusations that he was had a violent temper. Uh, I'm assuming that's true because I've heard it so many times, but I don't know. Yeah.
yeah,
Mhm.
he could get violent.
Yeah.
And I was going to say about Yoko and the breakup and that period. We'll go into it as much as we can as time allows. If you want to sort of hate anything around the Beatles, the stuff to hate is kind of like drugs and
Mm,
heroin and
mm,
pills and alcohol and
sure.
that stuff. If I have to, okay, I don't think okay. There's of the people we've covered on Art of Darkness, uh, year four now, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
congrats. Yeah.
we had our 3 year anniversary
Yeah.
recently. So this is
Yeah.
our
Yeah,
first
just the other day.
episode, yeah, so wonderful.
Mhm.
Of all the people we've covered so far, nobody has had more ink spilled about them.
Yeah, I believe that.
Nobody
Yeah.
provokes stronger feelings and opinions. Nobody is more ubiquitous
Mhm.
than John Lennon. He founded the Beatles, and by his own in his own words, he said, I started the Beatles, I broke it up.
Mhm.
He
Mhm.
was so, and there's a lot of that tension inside that band around, who's the top dog and who's in charge, much like you and I, Brad.
Yeah.
You know,
Real Lennon McCartney vibes. Yeah.
just
Yeah.
keep playing the hits. Why do we got to put Obla Di Obla Da on this album? It just makes like
It's
that kind of
Obla
thing.
Di Obla Da's a banger, okay?
um, and then there was the fifth Beatle, Brian Epstein, and this gets
Hmm.
sort of lost. You know what? We're going to come to it. So
Yeah,
let me do the housekeeping, and then we'll get into the biography and try to have a good time today and be
cool.
extemporaneous and do as much as we can to get through the life of the great John Lennon. So I'm going
Yeah.
back into my notes here. Uh, yeah, fun. Let's see. Yeah. I mean, I already mentioned Telegram, t.me/art of dark pod. There's a good chat going on in there. We got 175 people in there right now, and you can join anytime. It's totally free. Just get in there. And if you want to win the respect of your fellows, one, read the rules. We have rules for that Telegram. We try to keep it civil and focus on art and creativity. But if you want to come in there and really win the respect of people, if you want to show that you're an Art of Darkness appreciator, post your favorite pen when you drop into the Telegram. People love that.
Yeah,
Uh,
that's a G2 Pilot G2, the 7 millimeter or
okay,
7 millimeter. Yeah, that's
sure.
my one. The seven. Yeah,
There you go. And
gel ink.
Brad's showing his pen off. So if you haven't subbed on YouTube and whatever, do it. YouTube.com/at Art of Dark Pod. So that's another little bit of housekeeping I want to mention. Imagine all the people signing up for Patreon. Can you
Yeah.
imagine? Wouldn't that be good? We have thousands of subscribers across different channels.
Mhm.
Spotify, I think, is the most popular. We have hundreds of Patreon patrons, and
Yeah.
I don't want to belabor this. I know some people get annoyed at the sort of shilling or whatever. We got to do it. This is how the
Mhm.
show is sustainable. This is how we can continue to do the show.
Mhm.
If you've listened to more than 2 core episodes, I would encourage you to chuck in $5 a month for Art of Darkness.
Yeah.
If this is part of your regular listening rotation, you're subscribed. When a new episode shows up, you go, there's a new core episode. Oh, I'm really excited. Please think about supporting the podcast.
Mhm.
Every time we get a new subscriber, it really sends a jolt, of how to say this. It's motivating.
Mhm. Oh
And
yeah, for sure.
yeah, we would do this podcast regardless. But that motivation helps, and we really appreciate it. So that's
Oh yeah.
patreon.com/art of dark pod. And we give you lots of good stuff, including the bonus After Dark episodes. This After Dark is going to be protracted. I got a lot of stuff for this After Dark. Here's what we're
All
going to
right.
talk about after the main episode, after the free episode that we give away, because we love doing this and we love talking about these figures and what motivated them to create. We always learn something from this, from doing this. All right,
Mhm.
so here's what we got in the After Dark. We're going to talk about John's controversial honeymoon in Spain with Brian Epstein,
Oh.
just as they started to blow up and
Hmm.
Beatlemania was kicking off.
Hmm.
So was John what was John's sexuality? There's some very
Okay.
interesting stuff. There's also and it came out as a consequence of this book, which I'm using as the principal source. This is John Lennon by The Life by Philip Norman. Here I
Hmm.
stopped. I gave up on putting pages into my outline
Yeah, it's a
because
lot.
I'm just going to be reading from this book a lot. And
Mm.
dipping in and out of the Wikipedia to kind of give it some structure. People are
Mm.
like, you use Wikipedia. I'm like, yeah, it helps. I mean, you try doing, what do you tried doing an entire life in 4 hours, gives us some structure. And also we do 20 episodes this year. We're going to do 20 core episodes.
Yeah.
So
Yes, sir.
yeah, we need a structure that's going to help. And then I have also
Mm.
got the Beatles, the biography by Bob Spitz. I'm going to dip in and out of that. And then I have a bunch of links from like Rolling Stone and other
Cool.
sources.
All right.
Okay,
All
so
right.
let me finish up the After Dark stuff. So we have this incest controversy. Did
Ooh.
John kind of possibly confess to having incestuous feelings toward his mother as a
Oh.
teenager? Very
Mm.
intense. And then there's an article from his sister that says this is ridiculous. How dare you?
Mm.
And I want to be clear too. Again, there are people, living people, who are
Right.
the children of John Lennon. I mean, Sean
Sure.
Lennon is active on Twitter. He's quoted at length at the end of this book. So, we always try to be sensitive when we cover our subjects. We do laugh a lot. What we say
Hmm.
is we laugh so we don't cry, but we
Hmm.
we do understand we're talking about real people. So we
Mm.
try to be balanced. We also just try to give everybody, in 4 or 5 hours, you're going to come away knowing a lot more about John Lennon than you went in, unless you're a Beatles person, in which case, you can abuse Brad at twitter.com/art of dark pod. All right. And we're going to talk a little more about how insane Beatlemania was, the Beatles and LSD and Timmy Leary,
Mm.
Lennon, Bowie, an amount of cocaine,
Oh boy.
and Lennon's FBI file. So I'm going to
Ah,
try to
yes.
cover all that stuff on
We
the.
love FBI files on Art of Darkness.
Anytime there's an FBI file, you kind of gotta do it, if
Yep.
if at all possible. So that'll be for Patreon after the core episode here, patreon.com/art of dark pod. All right. I've already kind of covered the source material that I'm using.
Mhm.
Um, and I just want to say I in 3 going now on 4 years of doing this Norman bio, and I know there's some controversy in it, and inevitably there will be,
Yeah.
but in terms of readability, this is one of the very best biographies that
Mm.
I've read. And
Cool.
and it's huge. I mean, it's 800 pages. I don't even know, 800 plus pages with the index. And Philip Norman is an award-winning novelist and biographer. And I was like,
Mm.
this reads like a Russian novel. And there it
Yeah.
is. He's a novelist. So he has a sensibility of a novelist writing about the life of someone whose life would be worthy of, you know, four Carl Knausgaard novels, right? I
Right.
mean, it's
Right. Right.
very, very much that. So all right, I mean, let's do this. Okay,
Hmm.
I'm just gonna get into the bio, and it's so funny because like I would read a little bit from the Wikipedia to kick us off here, and it's like in a paragraph they cover what is like 150 pages that's talked about in this biography.
Right.
So I'm just going to get into it. So let's say this. John Lennon was born on the 9th of October, his lucky number 9,
Mhm. Oh yeah.
number
Mm.
9, at Liverpool Maternity Hospital to Julia née Stanley and Alfred Lennon. His grandfather, and this is where this biography begins. His grandfather was like a how do you describe it? Like a vaudeville singer, right? So listen to
Mm.
this. John Lennon was born with a gift for music and comedy that would carry him further from his roots than he ever dreamed possible. As a young man, he was lured away from the British Isles by the seemingly boundless glamour and opportunity to be found across the Atlantic. He achieved that rare feat for a British performer of taking American music to the Americans and playing it as convincingly as any homegrown practitioner, or even more so. For several years, his group toured the country, delighting audiences in city after city with their garish suits, funny hair, and contagiously happy grins. This, of course, was not Beatle John Lennon, but his namesake, paternal grandfather, more commonly known as Jack, born in 1855. Lennon is an Irish surname from O'Leanin or O'Lonane, and Jack habitually gave his birthplace as Dublin, though there's evidence that his family had already crossed the Irish Sea to become part of Liverpool's extensive Hibernian community sometime previously. He toured the U.S. As part of is a member of Andrew Robertson's colored operatic Kentucky Minstrels.
Whoa,
So his
okay.
grandfather was part of a minstrel show
Okay.
that toured the United States in the 1880s.
Huh.
Just a little
Wow.
bit of you know, just a little bit of history to give you
Yeah.
some idea. Um, Hopefully, we're already picking up the idea that that Liverpool is a port city,
Mm.
and a lot of sailors. His father was a sailor, or was like
Mm.
on ships, if not a sailor. I don't know the exact terminology, but we'll talk about
Mm.
it. So there was a so Elf, his father, is courting Mimi, or not Mimi, excuse me, Julia.
Mm.
Mimi is Lennon's aunt, who would ultimately become his mother, like his
Oh.
mother figure. Yeah,
Okay.
John. We'll talk about this. Okay,
Hmm.
John had an upbringing that would be familiar to anybody who is from lower middle class, a little bit down and out, rough childhood, raised by an auntie, raised by aunties
Hmm.
because mom can't handle it, dad's gone. I mean,
Mm.
you know his later song Mother, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Mama come home, daddy don't go, something
yeah,
like that. Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
brutal. It
Oof.
all comes from that. And at one point he would go through primal scream therapy. And
Oh,
I think that impacted his songwriting for that last decade before his
probably, yeah.
untimely assassination. I
Huh.
mean, that stuff is so raw. His later stuff, there's no. It's like and he was annoyed at Paul's what he called like granny music. He was annoyed at Paul's kind of obladi oblada. So instead, he's like, I'm going to sing about like my parents abandoning me.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
He went so hard. Okay, so
Mm.
um, Elf and Julia finally married and of course we know the song Julia as well.
Mhm.
Elf and Julia finally married in December of 1938 when he was 26 and she 24. A few weeks earlier, Britain's Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain had returned from Munich waving the piece of paper that guaranteed peace with Hitler's Germany in return for abandoning Czechoslovakia to invasion and genocide. The
Mm.
mood of, well, yeah, nothing's free. The mood of national euphoria, when it lasted, produced a sharp surge in the marriage rate as many young people felt their future to be more secure.
Mm.
That's going to happen after the Kansas City Chiefs win, and Tay Tay, dude, it's good. Where this is the next baby boom. It's happening.
Yeah. All right. Hey, whatever it
Yeah,
takes. Yeah.
yeah. Kevin, stick to the script. No. But Elf and Julia took their belated plunge with no more thoughts of the future than they ever had. According to Elf, she dared him to do it one night at the pub, and he was never one to refuse a dare. Neither of their families was told in advance what they had decided.
Mm.
That's going to play well. On December 3rd, Julia left home as if it were just another working day, and at noon rendezvoused with Elf at the register office in Bolton Street behind the Adelphi Hotel. This, of course, is in Liverpool. The only
Mm.
witnesses to the ceremony were Elf's brother, Sidney, whom he'd let into the secret at the last moment, and one of Julia's usherette colleagues. Afterwards, Sidney stood the new Mr. and Mrs. Lennon drinks and a meal of roast chicken at a pub over the road called the Big House. They spent the evening at the cinema watching a Mickey Rooney film, then separated to spend their wedding night at their respective homes.
Mm.
Mimi was never to forget the heart sinking moment when Julia walked in, threw her wedding certificate onto the table, and said, There, I've done it. I've married him. Auspicious. Pop
Yeah.
Stanley's initial reaction was also one of explosive horror and disgust, but under the gentler influence of his wife Annie, he accepted that there was nothing that could be done. Stiff upper lip and all that, right?
Yeah.
Indeed, that as a conscientious father, he must try his best to give the newlyweds a proper start in life. Swallowing his feelings, Pop volunteered to leave the family flat in Berkeley Street and rent, probably Barclay Street, and rent more spacious accommodations so that Julia and Elf could move in with Annie and him. The chosen property was number 9,
Hmm.
Newcastle Road, a bay windowed terrace house a few minutes walk from Penny Lane and
Hmm.
Elf's alma mater, the Blue Coat Hospital. All right,
Hmm.
so, and they're living together throughout 1939 as the war is absolutely rocking uh,
Yeah.
Britain.
Hmm.
And Elf would go to sea now periodically. and he returned home in time for the first Christmas of World War II, where they conceived his only child at 9 Newcastle Road one day in January 1940. Finding themselves unusually alone in the house for a couple of hours, they made love on the kitchen floor. They
Mm.
had not been trying for a baby, and Julia's immediate pregnancy was equally dismaying to them both. 90% of people of my generation were born out of a bottle of whiskey on a Saturday night, and there was no intention to have children. John would
Mm.
later say, I was never really wanted.
Mm.
All right.
Yeah,
Get
that's. I was just gonna say, like, his dad's out to sea during. If you're out to sea during the war, even if you're not part of the Navy, that's dangerous business, right? I mean, yeah, yeah, yeah. You're out
yeah,
there in the world. There's torpedoes flying around. Yeah.
right. Yeah, and you're coming home to your wife's family's house and you're
Mm.
you're sneaking one in on the kitchen floor when you can.
Right, right,
Right.
right. Oof.
And it's interesting because ultimately, when John ends up with Mimi, of the four Beatles, I think technically he was the poshest. Like,
John
not,
was?
yeah, not
Yeah.
posh, but like he
Right.
was like, and of course, because they have a very rigid, very strict, very clear, yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. And like Ringo and George, I think were from, I think would amount to the projects,
Oh, really?
council
Okay.
housing. And then I think Paul too. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. They were working class boys from Liverpool.
Yeah.
They were, we'll see. We can really break if we were to break this episode up into parts, it would be Liverpool, Hamburg, Liverpool, London. They go back and forth to Hamburg, but London,
Mhm.
New York for John.
Mhm.
That's the
Mhm.
trajectory we're going to be on here, with a little stop in India to
Yeah.
go and
Yeah.
meet
Yeah.
what he would later sort of he would. Yeah, he
Yeah.
did not ultimately appreciate the Maharishi.
Hmm.
And when the Beatles
Okay.
left the Maharishi, he just picked up and went to hang out with the Beach Boys.
The Maharishi did?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. What a racket. That rocks, dude. We need more of that energy,
Yeah.
dude. Yeah, yeah. Just go right into it. Just lean right into that stuff. That says we're bigger than the Maharishi. How about that?
Right, right.
All right. So Mimi, who's going to figure very heavily in this story, would often relate how the baby's arrival on October 9th was marked by an especially ferocious German night attack. According to Mimi, when news came that Julia had been delivered of a 7.5 pound boy, the air raid sirens were wailing and all public transport, as usual, had ground to a standstill. Such was her excitement that she ran the 2 miles from her parents' home to the Oxford Street Maternity Hospital, oblivious of bombers and their parachute-borne landmines. Sheesh. The
Hmm.
worst that Hitler could do seemed trivial by comparison with this marvelous event. So yeah, there was a really bad week, a lot of explosions. Apparently, on the night of October 9th into the 10th, the Luftwaffe stayed away. As Mimi hurried toward Oxford Street, she would undoubtedly have seen the results of previous bombing. It's an interesting moment in Hard Day's Night. I think it's in probably in Liverpool where they shot it. I'd have to look it up, but there's some very that's a good one to watch. Hard Day's
Hmm.
Night. There's a shot where the police are kind of chasing them around, and there's a guy trying to lockpick a car, and he's right in front of a bunch of rubble. It almost looks like a Godard film. Like it's
Hmm.
very well framed and shot. It's that movie's a might be the best jukebox movie ever made. And it's just a
I,
vehicle for the Beatles music, but
sure.
it's in black and white. It's goofy. It's fun.
I've
Uh,
never seen it.
oh, you have to watch Hard Day's Night. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Ringo goes missing. There's no plot at
No,
all.
no, I wouldn't even
Yeah,
want there to be a plot. Come on.
no, exactly. Yeah. They wouldn't get into plot really until Pepper. And even
Mm.
that, they sort of said,
Mhm.
what
Mm.
really makes it a concept album? A couple tags at the beginning and the end, and then the
Mm.
anyway.
Mm.
All right. So yeah. Yeah. So Mimi's very happy that the baby's born. Now, E.M. Forrester once wrote that there's a battle fought over every baby. The battle over this particular Liverpool baby was to be fiercer than most, revealing not that he wasn't wanted, as he came to believe, but that too many people wanted him too much.
Mm.
Nor would it become clear for some time who had won him. About his name, at least, there was no conflict. Julia decided to call him John, which pleased Elf as a tribute to his paternal grandfather. And Kentucky minstrel, but was also classically English middle class, suggesting every quality the Stanleys most admired: plain, upright, steady, predictable, uncomplicated. And with fierce wartime patriotism in common, neither side of the family would object to his mother giving him the middle name Winston after Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Um, Elf's long absences from home would later brand him in his son's eyes as feckless, selfish, and unloving, but it should be remembered that as a merchant sailor, he was doing one of the most vital and dangerous jobs in Britain's war effort. So yeah, so there you go. Let's see. I want to read a little more. So he's at sea during the war. Mimi persuades Julia to move to suburban Woolton, where she had recently resettled, and there's some stress in the marriage, etc. Let's keep going. You getting a picture kind of where he's coming
Yeah.
from here? Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's see. The marriage is falling apart. John is essentially a child of divorce.
Mhm.
In 1946, Elf, excuse me, returned from another cruise to find Julia openly involved with a sleek-haired hotel waiter named John, aka Bobby Dykins. So
Mm.
Julia's stepping out,
Mm.
and Elf is almost certainly he's got one in every port, as they would say.
Mm.
Um,
Mhm.
this time, however, the cuckolded husband wasn't prepared to take it lying down. Um, I actually think there was a pregnancy that I sort of blasted over. So she got pregnant while he was gone. And
Mm.
yeah. And they gave up a child for adoption. I mean, you
Oh,
have to
wow.
imagine the embarrassment and shame this would have caused. I mean, this is just devastating. And of course, her parents think of themselves as an upright middle class
Right.
English family.
Right.
She's a wild child.
Yeah.
Um, So a furious night altercation took place at 9 Newcastle Road between Elf Julia, her new man friend, and Pop Stanley after Julia announced she was setting up home with Dykins and taking John with her.
Ooh.
Oof. Awoken by the angry voices, John came to the stairhead in time to see his mother screaming hysterically as Elf manhandled Dykins out the front door. Homewrecker? When Elf himself awoke the next morning, John had been spirited away by Pop Stanley, and Julia was moving out her furniture, helped by a female neighbor. What a scene. Elf pitched in to
Yeah.
help them, telling Julia, with the ostentatious self pity of a country and western ballad, to leave him only a broken chair to sit on. So he went back to sea, right? And let's see here. It was not an easy call for Mimi to make. And it doubtless caused even the unvengeful Elf a measure of quiet satisfaction. For the yeah, for the Stanley family. So Mimi's calling her, saying calling Julia, saying you got to come back, to Liverpool. For the Stanley family's hostility toward Julia's new man friend, Bobby Dykins, was more virulent than anything he himself had ever suffered at their hands. According to Mimi, Julie and John had moved back into 9 Newcastle Road, and Dykins was also now in residence there, confronting John with the daily spectacle of his mother, in the accepted phrase, living in sin.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hmm.
Of most immediate concern was that John seemed not to like his new daddy and had turned up on Mimi's doorstep in Woolton, having walked the 2 miles from Newcastle Road on his own.
Hmm.
Despite all her hostility to Elf, she had been forced to concede that he missed and needed his real father. Elf then spoke to John, who asked him excitedly when he was coming home. He replied that he couldn't break articles by deserting his ship, but promised to come as soon as the Queen Mary returned to Southampton 2 weeks later. So Elf comes back, arrives at Mimi's, and John is staying at Mimi's. And let's see. Right. At this point, Mimi presents Elf a bill for various necessities, which she said she'd had to buy for John since his arrival.
Hmm.
Heavy. This is
Jeez.
some real stuff. If you've
Yeah.
ever, I don't know about your childhood, Brad, but I know certain people can relate to this for
Mhm.
sure.
Mhm.
And I was going to say earlier that This one means a lot to me because, because my father passed away when I was very young, people
Mhm.
who've listened to the show know this, he was a rock and roller. And when my
Mm,
dad died, all the rock and roll went away. And I'm not
mm,
throwing shade at my stepdad, but my
mm.
stepdad was a country music guy. So all the rock
Oh,
and roll went away. But my
mm,
mom always kind of carried that thread along.
mm.
We listened to some pretty good country music. It wasn't all just
Yeah,
garbage,
yeah.
but
But it's a different vibe. It's a different vibe. Yeah, for
very
sure.
different vibe.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it
Mhm.
was wild because when I was a teenager and I started getting into the classic rock, I couldn't listen to it initially because it was so, um, it would set me off because it would take me right back to my childhood. Like every time,
Wow.
because I know we had Sabbath in the house, I know we had Zeppelin in the house, and we had Beatles in the house.
Hmm.
And when a parent dies at a very young age, you gather stories about them like a squirrel hoarding for the winter. You want to hear every story.
Mm,
One of my
mm,
mom's favorite stories about my dad was how much he loved the Beatles and how
mm,
devastated he was when John Lennon died.
mm,
You want to connect to the boomers.
mhm,
All right. Not
mm.
all boom. Hashtag not all boomers. You want to connect to the boomers who we love, the boomers you love in your
Mhm.
life. Ask them where they were when John Lennon died.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
That's it's
It's a
a
big deal.
9/11 level event. It's a
Hmm.
JFK level event.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
not
Hmm.
when he died, when he was assassinated
Assassinated.
by a
Yeah,
lunatic
yeah.
with a copy of Catcher in the Rye.
Oh, no way.
We can't blame Salinger for that. All
You
right,
mean the
so
book that they made us all read when we were like 14 in school?
they made you read Catcher in the Rye
Oh
in
yeah.
school. Oh, they
Yeah.
do things different in
Yeah.
Michigan.
I mean, I liked it, but you think about anyway. Yeah.
Hey, you know what's interesting? There's some discourse going around on Twitter right now about how grumpy everybody is that shows like Mystery Science Theater 3000 have been kind of LAified.
Mm-hmm.
And
Hmm.
all this Midwestern cultural commentary has been taken over from people in LA. And I'm like, we make this show in Minnesota and Michigan.
Yeah, that's Midwest as
Okay,
Midwest AF, as they
that's
say.
right. That's
Yeah.
right. Yeah,
Yeah.
mid best. All right. So Elf gets this bill, and he had been making profitable black market dealings in nylon stockings and other contraband. So he had a lot of
Mm.
cash. He gave
Hmm.
maybe 20 pounds. Um, and then he decided he had no alternative but to abduct his son the following day. I
Wow.
finally made up my mind that I would take John to Blackpool with me, making some excuse that I was taking him shopping and to see his granny. So Elf stays the night, and there's this fight over John. Elf has this idea that he's going to go to New Zealand, um, and he's essentially made to pick between his parents, which is devastating. When
Yeah.
John was brought into the room, his first reaction after their days of fun and intimacy with his father was to climb into Elf's lap. But when Julia admitted defeat and turned to leave, he jumped down and ran after her, burying his face in her skirt, sobbing and begging her not to go. To break the impasse, Elf pleaded with her to give their marriage another chance, but Julia would have none of it. Elf then told John he must choose between going with Mummy or staying with Daddy. If you want to tear a small child in two, there is no better way. John
Mhm.
was bitter. John was angry. John had every right to be
Understandably.
bitter and
Yeah.
angry. John also wanted to fix the world.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah. John went to Elf and took his hand. Then, as Julia turned away again, he panicked and ran after her, shouting to her to wait and to his father to come too. But
Mm-hmm.
paralyzed once more by fatalistic self pity, Elf remained rooted in his chair. Julia and John left the house and disappeared into the holiday crowds. See how excellent this biography is? It's
Hmm. Yeah.
very well written.
Hmm.
That evening, good-hearted Mr. and Mrs. Hall sought to cheer Elf up by taking him to a pub called the Cherry Tree and persuading him to do his Al Jolson routine for its assembled customers. His all too appropriate song choice was Jolson's Little Pal, a eulogy to some angelic sunny boy tucked in a soft, safe nursery as his faithful dad watches adoringly over him. Cats in the Cradle and the Silver Spoon. Instead of
Hmm.
little pal in each verse, Elf sang Little John. It made tears stream down his cheeks. Although ever the pro, he sang the song to its end amid a storm of clapping and whistling. Unlike the little pal he had given up, Elf Lennon would never find crowds oppressive nor applause wearisome. So
Hmm.
that happens.
Hmm.
Uh, yeah. I mean, he's a child of divorce and
Yeah.
pretty heavy. So I'm
Yeah.
just checking back in with the overall outline. Um,
Yeah, making a kid choose like that in a very sort of specific moment, like I'm here, that's oof, that's rough.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely rough. Now there's some controversy here. So according to another author, Mark Lewison, Lennon's parents agreed that Julia should take him and
Mm,
give him a home. Billy Hall, who witnessed the incident, has said that the dramatic portrayal of a young John Lennon being
mm,
forced to make a decision between his parents is inaccurate.
mm.
Okay, so here we are. We're in the fog of war here.
Right.
With Lennon, again, nobody has had more ink spilled about them than John Lennon and the Beatles. So who knows the
Mhm.
truth? In any case, it feels emotionally accurate. So
Yeah.
let's
Well, I
let's
mean,
say that.
when you're a little kid too, even if it didn't get this dramatic, you have to choose now. It might have felt like that, sort
Mm,
of, right? It might have
sure.
felt like them torn
Yeah,
between
that
these
story
people.
that story came to be somehow.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Uh when we come to the incest material, there's a similar controversy, right?
Mm,
And
true.
we're not taking a position either way. Let's just say
Yeah.
that. We're just trying to
Yeah.
give you the information. Um The oft-repeated tale of how Mimi Smith came to assume sole responsibility for bringing up her 6-year-old nephew, John Lennon, could not be simpler or more heartwarming. That's crazy that he walked 2 miles when he was like 5 or 6 to his aunt's at one point. I mean, it's just heavy, dude. I
Mm.
won't let my children walk 2 blocks.
Right. Right.
It's a great different world.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, Mimi was the type of English people of earlier generations called a good sort or a brick, a modern day Betsy Trotwood, whose exterior brusqueness camouflaged a heart of purest gold. When John's real father and mother proved deficient, she took it on herself to fill the role of both together, making it her single minded mission to give him, in her own words, what every child has a right to, a safe and happy home. That was
Shouts
the
out to
version of
Mimi, man.
Listen, listen,
Yeah.
shout out to all the aunties, the great
Hmm.
aunties. I had a great auntie who picked up a lot of slack. It happens when there's
Mm.
death in the family, when there's divorce in the family comes together and picks it up. I think
Yeah.
David Mamet said family are the people who you have to forgive if they commit a crime against you, and they
Mm.
inevitably will.
Mhm. Mhm.
So
Mhm.
yeah, family looks after family.
Mm.
So John would say about this, my parents couldn't cope with me. He was to tell countless
Mm.
interviewers. So I was sent to live with an auntie. Nothing can detract from Mimi's care and self-sacrifice in the years that followed. If you like the Beatles, you got to stand Mimi. Mimi like
Mhm.
saved John's life. Um, so and then this goes on to say that the background was a little more complicated. She was married to a man named George Smith, um, and he was on the scene too. Let me get into here. But she had no children of the four, I think four sisters. Uh, Her explanation was that she'd had to be a mother to the others during their girlhood and didn't want to go through it all again. She was, in fact, thought not to care very much for small children, preferring them when they grew older and could join in intelligent conversation about things that she cared for, such as reading and music. Young kids are hard.
Mhm.
Young children are really hard. Young
Mhm.
our toddler, our 3-year-old is methodically destroying our house. Every day
Right.
there's a new adventure. There's
Right.
something new that's childproofed and broken.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, it's a lot. Um, from George Smith, Mimi received social standing as a farmer's wife in a salubrious, part rural area and a home that more than met her exacting standards. This was a house named Mendips in Woolton, and so this is where John would spend an awful lot of his childhood. Mimi always described her acquisition of John solely in terms of family duty, the habit ingrained since childhood of straightening out her younger sister's muddles.
Mm.
Julia had met someone else with whom she had a chance of happiness, she would say, and no man wants another man's child. Tell me about it. In fact, the relationship between Julia and her head waiter, Bobby Dykins, had never excluded John in any way. Far from discriminating against another man's child, Dykins was prepared to bring John up as if he were his own.
Hmm.
I'm not the step. What is it? I'm not the stepdad. I'm the dad who
The
stepped
dad who
up.
stepped up. Yeah.
Hey, respect to the stepdads out there.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
it's an important thing. It's a real thing.
Mhm.
Um, we wish there was a better term for it too.
Mhm.
Uh, Dykins was prepared to bring John up. Okay. He was serious enough about this to have persuaded Julia to move out of 9 Newcastle Road with John and into a small rented flat at Gateacre, where the hoped for family unit might evolve with less pressure from the relatives. But for Mimi, Julia's living in sin. So publicly with Dykins, threatened to make her sister the object of scandalized gossip, such as even Elf Lennon had never visited on the super respectable Stanley family. Julia might be old enough to lead her own life, but little John should not have to live in such an atmosphere of moral laxity. Uh, it claims here that Mimi had an almost mystical affinity with John since first
Mm.
seeing him newly born. She decided she wanted him, her niece Leela Harvey says, and who could blame her because he was the cutest little fellow you ever saw. So Mimi wages this campaign and finally wins John and then gives him, you can imagine the kind of madhouse John's early childhood was. Um, there's this furious argument between all the sisters, and then, which yet again dragged up Julia's wartime affair with the
Mhm.
Welsh soldier, the one that ended in the pregnancy. Um, Julia was looking for sympathy, but as far as I was concerned, she'd made her bed and she had to lie in it. And I told her, "You're not fit to be a mother." She reacted like I'd slapped her in the face. Well, yeah, I just said I think I should have John. It just seems to make sense. George was very fond of him. In many ways, our house was a lot quieter than the places he'd been living in, and we could give him some stability. He'd had a bit of a bumpy ride up till then. In Mimi's version, Julia was by now ready to agree willingly, even thankfully, but John's cousin Leela, who was also in the room, saw a very different end to the long tug of love. I remember Mimi standing in front of John and telling Julia, "You're not having him."
Mm.
Ooh. What's crazy now that I think about it is that then, as a Beatle, John would experience the same tug of war from the fans.
Oh,
It's like
right.
he experienced a microcosmic version of Beatlemania as a child, and the
Right.
phenomena reoccurred. It was
Right.
so crazy. I'm going to be a little out of order here, but it was so crazy during Beatlemania. They had to hide the fact that John was married to
Oh,
Cynthia.
really?
Yeah, Cynthia had to be hidden away because you're not gonna put out like the world's first boy band, like the world's
Hmm.
first global boy band.
Hmm.
They can't be married. They're like in their early 20s. They can't.
Right.
The
Right.
fantasies. Oh, I'm in love with John. I'm in
Right.
love I'm in love with Ringo. I'm a weirdo.
Right. Right.
We love Ringo. We love
Yeah.
Ringo.
Yeah.
Ringo's one of my absolute, but you get the idea, right?
Hmm.
I'm
Yeah.
different.
Yeah. No,
I
everybody
think
picks the
Ringo's
one
cute.
they
You pick your
want, and
one and it's a whole thing. Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, Ringo's the best. He's my new favorite Beatle after this.
Octopus in the
Um,
Garden is a banger.
yeah,
Octopus's
Octopus's
Garden.
Garden.
It's a banger.
Absolutely, dude. Yeah, yeah,
Hmm.
yeah. Yellow Submarine, please.
Hmm.
Human Metronome, underrated drummer.
Hmm. Hmm.
Uh,
Hmm.
it
I
just
believe it.
and also like a screen presence. Ringo would go on and like make movies, and he's a
Mm-hmm.
fun Twitter follow too because he's just emojis. He's just a heart and love and
I
peace
like
and
that.
love and yeah. We need
Yeah.
what happened to the peace and love stuff, man? I think everybody got so jaded and burnt out, and everybody got real
Yeah.
estate licenses and
Right.
the country
Right.
went and
Right.
lost a bunch of wars, and everybody's
Yeah.
spying on everybody. And it's like, come
Yeah.
on, come
Yeah.
on. We could use a little bit of peace and love, right?
Yeah.
War
Yeah.
is over if you want it.
The hippie dream kind of died and you just decided to throw every aspect of it out. Right.
Right, right, right,
It's
right.
like, well,
It's maybe not all of it.
yeah,
Yeah,
maybe they got one or two things right, you know.
sure, right. Yeah,
Yeah.
maybe we shouldn't carpet bomb people.
Right.
So yeah, so Mimi gives life structure, meals, bed at the same time, bath and shampoos, uh, you know, in a clawfoot tub before meals. They're saying grace. He was not allowed to come to the table without first washing his hands or leaving without saying, "Can I get down?"
Mm,
And above all, and this is extremely important for us Americans to understand when we have a global audience, but
mm,
here we are. Above all, Mimi was determined that he should speak like a nice middle class boy from the suburbs, not a coarse, raucous whacker. Under
mm,
her tutelage, there was soon not the slightest taint of inner city Liverpool in John's voice.
mm,
I had high hopes for him, and I knew you didn't get anywhere if you spoke like a ruffian. I remember once he came home from town on the bus, and he'd heard these Liverpudlians talking to each other, scouse, you know. and he was shocked. He couldn't understand what they were talking about. I told him he should avoid people like that. He was a country boy. He would never meet them except if anyone came to the house to mend something. It was a world away, really. Middle class.
Hmm.
Where, and similar things happen in America. You get your grammar beveled off by your
Yeah.
school teacher mother, like I did. You're not saying ain't. Stuff
Yeah.
like that happens, but it's not
No,
to this degree.
if you're trying to maintain some social mobility, you got to know the various shibboleths and conventions of that class you're trying to get into. You got to play because that's how that's how everybody stacks each other up, even if it's not conscious. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, right. And they're very conscious about it.
Hmm.
I remember after spending a year in England, I was in like 2007-ish. I read an article on my way out, and it was really funny. It was some American going, when Americans, this is some woman American who had moved over there. She said Americans tend to think that Londoners and the British are very, very polite because they listen so attentively. And it's only after a while that you realize they're listening for hints that will help them place you in the social order because they
Very
can't do it
interesting.
just from an
Right.
accent.
Right. Yeah. So they've got
I,
to.
and I don't know how much that's changing now, but in any case, I thought that was pretty wild.
That's interesting.
Okay, so let's see. Talking about sort of first love, and he was especially fond of his cousin Layla, the daughter of Aunt Harry's Egyptian first marriage, a stunningly pretty girl with a smile that can still light up a 40-year-old sepia snapshot. Leela was only 3.5 years John's senior, so she became his most regular playmate and accomplice inside the family. She remembers a sunny-natured, affectionate small boy who had no inhibitions about hugging and kissing. Think of all those songs about love that John wrote before he was even 21, she says. How could he have done that if he hadn't had a lot of love in his own life? Uh, he seemed to remember little of the war that had been waged over him or of being passed around competing would-be parents like a parcel. Mimi volunteered little information, replying to his questions in only the briefest anodyne fashion. She told me my parents had fallen out of love. She never said anything directly against my mother and father. I soon forgot my father. It was like he was dead. But Elf was very much alive, and to begin with, at least, still a very real threat to Mimi's guardianship. She had not officially adopted John, and I don't think she ever did. Yeah, nor would she ever do so.
Hmm.
Elf remained married to Julia on paper and in a position of moral ascendancy as far as the law was concerned. At any moment, he could have walked through the front door and demanded that his son be returned to him. This danger was soon neutralized, in large part thanks to the hapless Elf himself. So let me see here. Oh, yeah, this is fun. After parting from John in Blackpool, he had drowned his sorrows at sea again, signing aboard the Royal Mail steamer Andes on her maiden voyage to Argentina. Buenos Aires had produced another of those apocalyptic misadventures that only seemed to happen to him. Elf was unlucky.
Hmm.
Picked up with some other British mariners in a routine police sweep, he found himself held in solitary confinement for 2 days. The explanation was that his captors had misread the page in his passport where his signature, A. Lennon, was immediately preceded by the name of his next of kin, given simply as John. He was therefore assumed to be John A. Lennon, a notorious murderer in Argentina
Oh
at the
no.
time, also bore his name. And the police had mistaken Elf for him. On regaining his freedom and returning to Britain, he resumed service on the Dominion Monarch, the most British named ship of all time. Dominion Monarch, but in posts of declining importance, first as assistant boots, shoe cleaner, then as silverman, custodian of restaurant silverware.
Oh
He's like
boy.
he's
Yeah.
like a
Yeah.
dishwasher. That's what he
Yeah.
would end up doing.
Wow.
So this he makes a big mistake here. By his own later account, he still cherished hopes of winning John back and carrying out their Blackpool scheme of emigrating to New Zealand. When the Dominion Monarch returned to Tilbury in December of 1949, he resolved to catch a train from London to Liverpool and have it out with Julia again. On his way to Euston Station, however, he was diverted by some shipmates into a Soho pub crawl. You ever been on a
Mm,
Soho crawl, Brad,
nah. Well, yeah, actually, yeah.
in London?
Not in London. Sorry.
Yeah. This is the other Soho.
The other
Yeah, this is
Soho.
where.
Yeah.
Yeah. Uh, this is where friend of the pod, Francis Bacon,
Mm.
would have been probably I assume bopping around at the time.
Probably, yeah, it's around the
Yeah.
same time. Yeah.
Yeah. This ended in the early hours of the following morning with a riotously drunken elf smashing the display window of a West End department store
Don't
and
do that.
attempting to waltz with the mannequin inside. Paul,
That's some partying right there. That's getting down.
yep, yep. And your accent as a Liverpudlian seaman probably not gonna help you in front of the magistrate.
Yeah. Right.
He was sentenced to 6 months in Wormwood Scrubs,
Mm.
which is a Harry Potter ass
I
name.
was gonna say I don't know what that is, but it doesn't sound good. Yeah.
When we were over there, one of my favorite things because they list the name of like the headmaster and the assistant headmaster at
Mm.
all of their what they call private schools, all their public schools. They
Mhm.
all have signs, and more often than not, it would be like headmaster Swack, uh,
Right.
assistant headmaster Payne. Like, what is this place real? What sort of
Right.
socialist fairy tale Harry Potter shit is this?
Right.
I love it over there. It's fun.
Yeah. Do
But
you have to have an aptonym? Like, is it necessary? Is it part of the citizenship?
is that what
Yeah.
those are called? Aptonym?
Yeah, when a
Yeah.
person's name reflects the
Oh, perfect.
thing they
Yeah,
are.
that's
Yeah.
good.
Yeah.
Okay,
Charles
so
Dickens famously every character's an aptonym just about.
right.
Hmm.
In any case, so now John's dad is his career at sea is done, and he wouldn't he wouldn't return to John's life for 20 years. And so
Oh,
he's just out of John's life now. And
wow.
yeah, Mimi takes over. Uh, let's see here. And this is a memory. On walks with Mimi or Uncle George, John would always linger outside Strawberry Field, peering through its heavy iron gate and up at its windows as if he felt some affinity with the less fortunate children who lived there. I assume there's a Salvation Army orphanage. He never missed the chance to visit the home each summer when it held a fundraising garden fete with homemade cake stalls and games offering prizes of plaster, Scotty dogs, peppermint rock candy, or lone goldfish suspended dejectedly in water-filled jam jars. I'd give him sixpence to spend on the stalls, Mimi remembered. He'd hear the Salvation Army band and he'd pull me along saying, "Hurry up, Mimi, we're going to be late." Just a little vignette of his childhood.
Hmm.
All right, so now we're going to get into music and rock and roll and all the rest of it. Brad, I got to stand up and use the loo, as they say. Can
Hmm.
you? Why don't you tell people about the next book that we're doing for book club? In the meantime, can you do
Oh
that?
yeah, yeah. Coming up later in February, we are going to be talking about Flannery O'Connor's Wise Blood. For people who haven't read that or haven't read Flannery O'Connor, I promise you, if you are at all interested in Southern literature, if you're at all interested in the kind of milieu that writers like William Faulkner or Cormac McCarthy tends to cover, this kind of fits right in there. Let me just give you a quick Wikipedia intro to it. The recently discharged from service in World War II and surviving on a government pension for unspecified battle wounds, Hazel Motes returns to his family home in Tennessee to find it abandoned. Leaving behind a note claiming a chifferobe as his private property, Mote boards a train for Talkenham. Um, he eventually becomes a sort of inverse traveling preacher. It's sort of like a sort of a religion of nihilism in a way, and things get very sordid and dark. It's an amazing novel, and I can't wait to talk to you guys about that in the Patreon Bookends Reading Club coming up later in February.
I will be reading it. I started it. This
Yeah,
bio was so huge. I got to read that.
yeah,
I got to
yep.
read Demian. I'm going on
Mm.
TR Hudson's pod to talk about
Ah,
Demian.
cool. Yeah.
So yeah, I got to read.
Yes,
Yeah, and
sir.
the way the book club works is there's a link on the website artofdarkpod.com. You can't miss it, and we have the dates in there. If you want to join us on Zoom, you can. We record them. So if you don't want to join us on Zoom, it's extra stuff for Patreon,
Yeah. Yeah, and listen
patreon.com/artofdarkpod.
back and it's a book where we pick stuff worth reading, and a lot of times stuff that uh it should be that is or should be in the canon. So yeah, I think people who like our show will really like Wise Blood.
Hmm. Getting back at it, we're getting into the music. So I'm back in the book, John Lennon, The Life, Philip Norman. Uh, thanks in large largest part to his minstrel grandfather and his would-be minstrel father, but also to numerous others on both sides of the family, John could be fairly said to have had music in his bones. Yet in his early years, the odds seemed weighted against him becoming a musician at all, let alone the one he finally did. In the early 50s, in Britain, music was something most people got along without. The technology for listening to it in the home consisted of gramophones with manually cranked turntables and thick wax 78 RPM discs the size of car hubcaps, which came in plain brown paper covers and broke when dropped. Rare was the household whose record collection numbered more than about a dozen of these sepia-wrapped, dust-attracting monsters. And then you didn't hear music in public either. Something to think about. You didn't hear it in the doctors. You didn't hear it at Target. You didn't hear it in the waiting room, at the doctors or in elevators.
Yeah.
There was no elevator music. Different world. I mean, that's a huge thing to think about how different our world is now.
Oh,
And
and
TV
imagine,
was...
imagine how magical it was when you heard something then, or you heard a song that you loved and maybe didn't know what it was, and then some years later it comes out again. It would be a totally different relationship to it.
Absolutely. And TV was different too. Expensive. Only a few thousand homes had it. There was one BBC channel, the Beeb, offering a scanty program in the afternoon and early evening. Radio was also a BBC monopoly. It's known as the wireless, broadcast music largely as a public duty to keep the factories running and the food lines quiet. You got the malaise after the war and World War, like they won, but it was not it was not a bright time until the 60s, which the Beatles were a part of. The Beatles were a part of that sort of turning revival, like what now? And the fact that they went, when we're going to get to it and talk at length about their time in Hamburg, the fact that they went and became these brilliant live performers in Germany is such
I've always been curious about that.
Yeah. Hey, well, I think there's a quality of you're sort of never a prophet in your hometown. There's a quality of like they're a bit of an oddity. So it's like, okay, well, go hear these. And when we get to that, their schedule was nuts in Hamburg. They were asked to like play like 8 hours set, like 8 hours with, 3 30-minute breaks. So you're going to figure out how to make 5 chords go the distance.
That's something we saw in the Nina Simone episode too, is like you worked at a bar and that you worked there like an employee working a full shift, but you either sink or you really figure some stuff out on a deep level. Yeah.
Absolutely. When they would be in Hamburg, George wasn't even there legally. He was 17. Cool. Essentially like working. They were working in the Reeperbahn, the red light district. I mean, they were They were in it. And they were like sharing a room behind the stage, and they'd all have a new lay every night, and they'd just give each other some space. But I mean, I think George once described, you'd walk into the room and you'd see a little bum moving up and down, then you'd run out. They were very intimate. They were on top of each other. Hamburg was like their war. Like that was their coming of age thing that they did together. But as we'll see, John would also he had like wank buddies. They'd all wank off together. Like, as one does.
Do they?
Well, I mean, I've read in books. Yeah, so the BBC had the one channel, but here you go. And then they had the radio. So Afraid was BBC's light program of overexciting its listeners that records with the faintest sexual frisson were banned from the airwaves, and continuity announcers forbidden to use such inflammatory terms as hot jazz. Professional musicians were a tiny fraction who had mastered their complex craft only after years of study, possessed little personality outside their playing, and in general projected an aura that was at once middle-aged, irritable, and foreign. For Mimi Smith, nothing more clearly defined the elf Lennon world from which she had rescued John than people enjoying raucous, accented sing-songs in their front parlors, or worse still, in the pubs wrapped around 1001 inner Liverpool street corners. The only music Mimi cared for was the classical kind. Okay, so now there you go. In John's family, there was only one person of any musical ability. His mother, Julia, though otherwise not noted for consistency, still kept up the banjo and piano accordion playing she had learned as a girl. She was a natural entertainer, liable at the slightest encouragement to break into impromptu performance. Judy, the children's name for her, played the banjo and accordion really well, her niece Leela remembers. She had a lovely singing voice that I can only compare to Vera Lynn's. And she was a wonderfully witty and entertaining person to be with. She could keep going for hours at a time, singing, telling jokes, doing impersonations, and you'd never get tired of it. From John's earliest childhood, his response to music was instant and visceral. In 1946, just before his 6th birthday, the BBC Light program started the nightly 15-minute adventure of Dick Barton, Special Agent, an austerity forerunner to James Bond. And austerity was the period right after the war, right? Introduced by a melodramatic tune called "The Devil's Gallop." Mimi remembered how deathly white John's face always went each evening at 6:45 as its frantic strains echoed through the house. All right. So age 7 or 8, he took up the mouth organ, just as both his parents, not to mention several of his uncles, had done at roughly similar ages. The epiphany occurred when a medical student who was boarding at Mendip's, usually Mimi would host boarders for extra money, right? Casually took one of the little silver oblongs from his pocket and blew a few notes on it, to John's huge fascination. The student offered to buy him a mouth organ of his own, provided he learned to play a tune on this one by the next morning. John disappeared with it, and in no time had learned to play two. So he had a natural musical ear. Yeah. And he would tinker on any piano he could get his hands on. Mimi refused to have a piano. "I wouldn't have it," she remembered. "We're not going down that road, John. None of that common sing-song stuff in here." Whoops.
We're trying to be upper middle class, John.
Yeah, right. There's a bit here about a churchyard, which they would remember read and rereading the etched inscriptions with their famous local names and forgotten tragedies. And here's one. Also, Eleanor Rigby, the beloved wife of Thomas Woods and granddaughter of the above, died 10th October 1939, aged 44 years, asleep. Mimi would later remember how comforted John seemed by the notion in Eleanor Rigby's epitaph that it wasn't gone forever, just asleep. Okay. Got to keep plugging away. So John had a gang, and he was a natural leader. He started the Beatles and he finished the Beatles by his own, words. And he was a leader of a group called the Outlaws. And this is when he was 12 or 13. Literally, they were called Lennon's gang, as people soon took to calling them, became the curse of a district otherwise blessedly free from persecution or disturbance. They trespassed on Allerton Golf Course, annoying the grave businessmen at play there and conducting riotous games of their own. One of John's favorite things to do, which he would continue to do, there's a lot of stuff that's not like in contemporary time, we would deeply frown on it, including some language, like the things he would call Brian Epstein, who was Jewish and gay, are not YouTube friendly, shall we say. But John loved to he loved to make like spastic motions. He loved to do that. He thought that was the funniest thing in the world. He'd call it going spazzy, and he would do it on stage sometimes and to mock people. Very strange.
Really? I've never heard of that.
And funny. When they were, listen, watch Hard Day's Night, and you can see he loved to pull faces. He would pull faces. He would, people forget like the sense of humor the Beatles had. The Beatles were really, really, really funny. And John ultimately was frustrated that he kind of, in his own mind, kind of sold out a little bit to be cleaned up for that early period. It always kind of bothered him. It bothered him when the Stones came along, and their image was equally as cultivated. They were cultivated as the antidote to the Beatles, but the Beatles broke ground. I mean, just having their hair the way they did was totally insanely scandalous, totally crazy. People lost their minds. They could not believe it, that it wasn't four boys in crew cuts. It was nuts. The politics of hair in the 60s. We could do an entire episode about hair in the 60s and 70s. In any case, as Beatlemania was happening, they would naturally sort of have to indulge. One, they didn't have the kind of protection that a group would have now. This was new days. I mean, you have to remember too, like around the same time, like the president was shot and killed. You could get to people then.
Mm,
in a way that you couldn't now. And even after the Beatles blew up, you could get to them. They only had like a couple of people helping them out. Like they didn't
mm.
have a staff of 50 people looking after them. It was like four or
Right.
five.
Yeah,
Yeah,
like
and
Tay-Tay's got an entire
sure.
enterprise.
Tay
Yeah.
has the entire offensive line of the Kansas City Chiefs,
Yeah. Yeah.
Super Bowl bound Kansas City Chiefs.
Yeah.
And Taylor, if you want to come on the pod anytime, this is an
Yeah.
open invitation.
Yeah.
I hope
Yeah.
everybody will spread the news.
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah. You can bring Kelsey. In any case, people would abuse. They would have to. They were expected to greet like cripples, uh,
Mm,
disabled children. We don't use that word anymore, but I'm going to have to
mm,
use it to tell this story. Uh, they'd come to town, and the hospital would line up children who wanted to see them,
mhm.
the Beatles, right? And
Sure.
it got, and it got to the point where some people would pretend to be in a wheelchair to meet the
Oh,
Beatles.
wow. Wow.
Uh,
Yeah.
and they ended up using the word cripple as a code when people would overstay their welcome in the green room or in the hotel room or the dressing room. One of them
Mm,
would say to Brian or someone else, "Cripples Brian," and
mm.
that was code to clear the room.
Interesting. Yeah.
Hmm.
Well, yeah, I mean, you're that popular, people want you that badly. You need some separation from it for sanity and physical safety and the project, you know, you're a business, right? You're trying to do things. You can't spend 16 hours a day talking to people. Yeah.
And it nearly killed him in the '60s, and then it finally did kill him. It
Hmm.
finally did kill him. John Lennon was killed by fame for sure.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
and for being John Lennon was killed for being John Lennon.
Right. Right.
Um,
Oof.
so not to spoil the ending, I assume you already know.
Yeah, I think most people know this. Yeah.
I should hope so. Yeah, so his gang would creep in through the back entrances of cinemas without paying and disrupt performances until ejected by furious usherettes. Their scrumping of apples from other people's gardens became so pestilential that one enraged grower appeared with a shotgun and fired both barrels at John's fleeing form. He became a Boy Scout, but then he had little time.
That's also like a little gang.
You were a
Yeah.
Boy Scout, right?
Yeah, it's like being a little gang. Yeah.
I was never a Boy Scout. Yeah, no.
Yeah.
Uh, he had little time for the Scouts' code of duty and respectfulness. One of his companions in the Badgers section recalls the alternative marching chorus he encouraged the others to sing as they tramped along in their shorts. We are the third, the mad third. We come from Allerton, and we are mad, mad. he he loved Alice in Wonderland and Through the
Mm,
Looking Glass. Those were still his favorites. Yeah, and that shows in the writing in his
mhm.
writing. Let's see. I want to make sure I cover this
Yeah, some of
stuff.
my favorite Beatles songs are Lennon's like borderline nonsense songs.
Mm. Oh yeah,
Yeah.
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 The For the benefit of Mr. Kite.
Yeah. Yeah.
That yeah, just fantastic. Um, so let's see. Julia was one of the first in John's circle to have television, so he
Mm.
would visit her. This is back in the day. If you had a TV, everybody would come over. Um, she'd fill her living room with extra seats, draw the blinds. Early television variety shows sometimes featured elderly survivors of the music hall and even the minstrel eras. Hetty
Wow.
King singing "All the Nice Girls Love a Sailor," Leslie Hutchinson, Hutch, I don't know how that one goes, who had first popularized Elf Lennon's beloved Begin the Beguine, and Rob Wilton, the Liverpool-born confidential comic, whose quavery monologues always began, "The day the war broke out." Uh, Julia's favorite was George Formby, a chipper Lancastrian with an outsized grin who strummed a banjolele while singing songs of innocent double entendre about Chinese laundries and window washers. Okay. Um, this is funny. Julia adored Formby, and John caught it from her. I remember one day when he was on TV and the money in the electric meter suddenly ran out. Judy almost went mad. So you're having to like
Ah,
put money into the electric meter to feed your TV. Just to give you an idea of the period and the time. It's like you're feeding your own television like a jukebox.
right, right.
Yeah. So yeah, and then the wireless was always on at his mother's house, and this is where he sort of got his exposure to like Bing Crosby.
Mm.
Um, so a little bit about Julia. During John's visits, Julia was always the bright, carefree, fun-loving person he looked on more as an elder sister than as a mother. But after he had gone, her daughter, Julia, remembers, she would sit down in the suddenly quiet living room, open up the gramophone, and put on the record that, for obvious reasons, was her favorite one of all, My Son John, by the British tenor David Whitfield. During the climactic closing verse with its eerily accurate prophecies, my son John, who will fly someday, have a wife someday, and a son someday, her eyes would fill with tears as though somehow or other she guessed she would never see it. Um, wow. So I'm looking at time and I'm just going, okay, what are we going to do here? Do my best. So he would end
Mm.
up going to school, obviously, and he, yeah, let's see here. And you can about imagine what it was like in school for John Lennon.
Mm.
Let me get back to the Wikipedia and sort of see where we are here. Yeah. So here's him. I think it. Let's see. A part of me would like to be accepted by all facets of society. This is him in 1980 commenting about his rebellious nature. Part of me would like to be accepted by all facets of society and not be this loudmouth lunatic poet musician, but I cannot be what I am not. I was the one who all the other boys' parents, including Paul's father, would say, keep away from him. The, you have a kid like that in your neighborhood?
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, of
You
course.
weren't that kid, were you?
No,
No.
I don't. I'm pretty sure I wasn't that
I don't
kid,
think
but
I was that kid, but
yeah.
yeah, yeah. The parents instinctively recognized I was a troublemaker, meaning I did not conform and I would influence their children, which I did. I did my best to disrupt every friend's home, partly out of envy that I didn't have this so-called home. But I did. There were five women that were my family, five strong, intelligent, beautiful women, five sisters. One happened to be my mother. She just couldn't deal with life. She was the youngest and she had a husband who ran away to sea, and the war was on, and she couldn't cope with me. And I ended up living with her elder sister. Now, those women were fantastic, and that was my first feminist education. I would infiltrate the other boys' minds. I could say, parents are not gods because I don't live with mine, and therefore I know. All right.
Mm.
So yeah, and it's going on and talking about the movies. Um, at some juncture, his uncle George died of a liver hemorrhage
Oof.
in 1955.
Sounds like a booze
Uh,
thing, but maybe not.
I'm not so sure. Let me see. Yeah, I have a little bit about this. Let's see. One sunny evening during that June of 1955, Mendip's most regular boarder, Michael Fishwick, was finishing supper in the morning room, and Uncle George was due to take his place at the table before starting night watchman duty at the Bear Brand factory. Suddenly, as Fishwick recalls, there was a terrible bang on the stairs. On his way down, George had collapsed from what the biochemistry student recognized as massive internal bleeding. He was rushed to Smithtown Hospital, but died soon after admission. The cause was given as a hemorrhage of the liver.
Mm.
John was away in Scotland with Aunt Mater and Uncle Bert and knew nothing of what had happened until his return home a couple of days later. As Mimi would remember, he came bouncing in his usual excitable self and asked where George was. When I told him he was dead, John just went very quiet. He didn't cry or anything like that. He just went up to his room. If there was any crying to do, he would do it on his own. He wouldn't want anyone else to see him like that. So now Mimi's obviously devastated. And coming out of this, yeah, in Northern England of that era, says this book, a woman widowed in her early 50s was expected to regard her life as over.
Mm.
Although Mimi was only just over 40, the thought of remarriage or any other relationship with a man never crossed her mind. From here on, so she thought, her only raison d'etre would be the care and protection of John. All right. So she's coping with a 14-year-old John Lennon.
Right.
Uh, so,
Who's in it? Who's got a gang of kids and is raising
mhm,
hell and getting in fights and yeah.
yep. Well, now I've got a little bit more about what happens to John here. Um, The loss of George's kindly, understanding masculine influence could not have come at an unluckier time. With John poised on the edge of adolescence and clamoring for information, advice, and reassurance, sex education did not feature on Quarrybank's syllabus, the school.
Hmm.
And Mimi could not be interrogated on such matters in other than the most general and theoretical terms. Like most of his generation, John had to piece together the facts of life from dirty jokes and diagrams on the wall of public urinals. It was still almost universally believed that masturbation called down the same heavenly wrath as the Old Testament's Onan suffered for letting his seed fall on the ground. Boys who wanked, tossed off, beat their meat, pulled their wire, or gave themselves a hand shandy — I like that one, hand sheep — did so at the supposed risk of going blind, growing hair on their palms,
Yeah.
or being permanently shut away in psychiatric institutions. As a Boy Scout, John had been bombarded with such warnings via Baden-Powell's Scouting for Boys manual. With its — that's so funny. We're scouting for boys. Hmm. With its puzzling metaphors about rutting stags and its advocacy of fresh air and exercise to stave off any inclination to beastliness. He became a dedicated wanker, undeterred by any fear. I love doing this show. I love doing this show. I get to say things like that at full volume. Undeterred by any fear of heavenly retribution. And as imagine there is no heaven. As always, in company with his arch crony Pete Shotton. This is one of this was like his Paul before Paul.
Okay.
Although he and Paul had a working relationship. Like their relationship, you could spend 10 hours talking about.
Yeah.
They were professionals. Like they were professional songwriters, singer-songwriters. Like that was their thing.
Yeah.
In any case, it was a further symbol of their closeness without any suggestion of the homoerotic. They wanked together as an act of Shenandoah rebellion and defiance and mutual showing off. Yeah, they just had a wank together.
Okay.
John, yeah, okay, proved to have a particular aptitude and near inexhaustible stamina. Once he accepted Pete's challenge to do it 10 times in a single day, the prize being unlimited access to the Shotton family's TV set. He failed to reach this target, but only by one go. Number 9.
Number
Number 9. Number 9. The wider circle of Lennon followers would also sociably wank all together, stimulating themselves and their neighbors by shouting out the names of sex goddesses like Sophia Loren or Gina Brigida. Sometimes at the critical moment, John would call out Winston Churchill or Frank Sinatra, and the onanist would collapse into giggles. All right. Okay. So I got the wanking story in.
Okay.
I'm glad I did that. Okay. All right. So here comes rock and roll, right? And do you know about Bill Haley? He's from Michigan.
The name rings a bell, but I don't.
He had been an obscure country and Western singer until 1951, but then he recorded a little song called Rock the Joint, and he started, singing black rhythm and blues. And yeah, they had to market that record with no biographical details, right? So dealing with a lot of, because you got a white guy singing black music. So there's like, okay, a little early. It's 1951. So now Rock Around the Clock comes out, and from this Haley guy, and that's a huge thing. So now we got rock and roll, and at the time it's kind of like, oh, this is another fad, right?
Right.
Here's a little bit about it. To capitalize on the sales of the Rock Around the Clock, and that's a banger. Rock Around the Clock, that's a banger.
Yeah.
Recording a film of the same name was rushed out, featuring Haley and the Comets with other emergent rock and roll celebrities like Freddie Bell and the Bellboys, the Platters, and Moondog Alan Freed. John went to see it expecting a life-changing experience, but came away disappointed. I was very surprised, he would recall. Nobody was screaming and nobody was dancing in the aisles like I'd read. I was all set to tear up the seats too, but nobody joined in. There's a little bit about what he's doing at school. As if to prove the fad had done no serious harm, so funny. Rock and roll, it always, and then it's hip hop, and it's always all the kids
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
Kanye now. It's always just one scandal after the next, and it's Alice Cooper, and it's Elvis, and it's Marilyn Manson, and it's Bowie, and it's turning the kids into weirdos and freaks. I mean,
Right.
it's something about rock and roll, man. Popular music.
Yep.
Um, John's school report for the 1955 summer term was considerably less of a disaster than usual. English, he is capable of good work and has done quite well. A good knowledge of the books. History, he has tried hard and worked well. Art, very satisfactory. Handwork, well, we know he's good at handwork.
Yeah, right.
Satisfactory
Hand
progress.
shandy class.
Yeah, exactly.
A plus.
Yeah, exactly. Physical training. Height 5'6.5". Weight 9 stone 4 pounds, 130 pounds. F for fairly satisfactory.
Mm.
Geography, undoubtedly trying harder. General science, an encouraging result. His work has been satisfactory, but his behavior in class is not always so. The only wholly negative entries were for French, disappointing, through
Mm.
fondness for obtaining a cheap laugh in class.
Mm.
And religious knowledge, his work has been of a low standard. All right. So they're hoping he's turned over a new leaf now and he's actually
Mhm.
doing school. Okay. So now who comes along? Elvis. All
Ah,
right.
yes.
And Elvis changes everything. John was guarded at first, remembering what a letdown Rock Around the Clock the movie was. The music
Mm.
papers were saying Presley was fantastic, and at first I expected someone like Perry Como or Sinatra. Heartbreak Hotel sounded a corny title, and his name seemed strange in those days. But then when I heard it, it was the end for me. I
Mm.
remember rushing home with the record and saying, he sounds like Frankie Lane and Johnny Ray and Tennessee Ernie Ford. So before there was the Beatles, there was Elvis, and who we will cover one day. Just have to mention how important that is, and then eventually later they would meet Elvis, which and in not too many years, believe it or not. Um, so let's see. So I'm gonna move us forward in the timeline. We got to get to the Beatles, man. Do you feel like you have a picture of his youth and his childhood, Brad?
Yeah.
You feel good about that?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Is he sympathetic to you at this point? You feel like
Well,
you kind of
yeah,
like him?
yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
No, I can relate to what this kid's going through for sure.
Hmm. Yeah. So I mean, he's going to start his first band here, right? And they were called the Quarrymen.
Mm.
Um, in 1956, Julia bought John his first guitar, an inexpensive Galatone Champion acoustic, for which she lent her son. So Julia buys him the guitar, £5 and 10 shillings, on the condition that the guitar be delivered to her own house and not Mimi's, knowing well that her sister was not supportive of her son's musical aspirations. Mimi was skeptical of his claim that he would be famous one day, and she hoped that he would grow bored with music, often telling him, "The guitar is all very well, John, but you'll never make a living out of it." Um, so Lennon's senior school years were marked by a shift in his behavior. Teachers at Quarrybank High School described him thus: he has too many wrong ambitions, and his energy is often misplaced, and his work always lacks effort. He is content to drift instead of using his abilities. Lennon's misbehavior created a rift in his relationship with his aunt. So now I need to talk about kind of what he was up to with women a little bit. Um, Let me see here, and then there's a very important thing that I have to cover. Okay, let's see. So there's sort of the idea that he might go to sea, right? And he has this
Mm.
band going. The main enticement of going to sea for young men those days was the unlimited sex it promised, and that at least formed no part of John's motivation. Alone of his circle, he was known to have lost his virginity when his curvaceous strawberry blonde steady Barbara Baker and sent to her, and since then had racked up a mounting score with several of the Quarrymen's more brazen camp followers. Going all the way, it used to be called, though the term is hardly accurate. In those days, the predominant form of contraception was the sheath, not yet known as the condom, but as the French letter or rubber Johnny, and sold only by pharmacists and barbers amid fandangos of furtiveness and embarrassment that few teenage boys were willing to brave.
Mm.
John was not about the contraception, as we'll
Mm.
see.
Mm.
Um, with the girls who would let him, John therefore used the risky method of coitus interruptus. Yeah, yeah. Well, the old joke, right? What do you call people who use the pull-out method?
No, I don't know.
Parents.
Bad. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. In Liverpool, it was known as getting off at Edge Hill.
God.
That being the last station on the northbound railway line where one would alight before the climactic downhill run into the Lime Street terminus. Since neither he nor Barbara had a place of their own, there was nowhere to do it but al fresco in the woods or on the grounds of some neighborhood stately home, or even in a churchyard whose
Hmm.
monuments at least provided a relief from damp grass. Do it in the graveyard, like friend of the pod, Mary Shelley.
Yeah.
Yeah. Years later, he would ungallantly remember a night, or should I say a day, when I was fucking my girlfriend on a gravestone and my arse got covered in greenfly aphids. Where
Yeah.
are you now, Barbara? That was a good lesson in karma and or gardening. In 19 yeah, in 1957, Barbara became pregnant. Despite
Hmm.
their long physical relationship and his dangerous habit of getting off at Edge Hill, John was not responsible.
Hmm.
Tired of sharing him with the Quarrymen's embryo groupies, she had chucked him sometime before and taken up with one of his friends just to spite him.
Hmm.
To avoid the inevitable stigma on her family, she was sent away from Liverpool to have the baby, which was then put up for adoption. John, she says, was almost as mortified as if he'd been the father. He was beside himself. He came round to our house and he went crazy, kicking a panel of the fence in and shouting. He was saying, "It should have been mine. It should have been mine." He
Hmm.
said he would marry me. It was typical of John that he came to see me and said it would be the best thing if we got married. He would stand by me. When Barbara returned home, they began going out again, but things were never the same, and the relationship faded quickly. So his term is ending at Quarrybank at the school, and he's the only one of his friends who and cronies who have had no idea what he was going to do.
Hmm.
Um, I mean, so his friend Pete Shotton uh, won a cadetship at the police training academy. I mean, everybody else is getting ready to go do something, and John has no clue what he's going to be doing.
Hmm.
I mean, he wants to play music, right? I mean, it's
Yeah.
almost a cliche. Um, okay, so let's see. At a certain point, he ends up going to art school, and he starts to meet Paul. So we got to introduce Paul here. This is gonna happen through the next hour. We're gonna meet all the cast of characters who are gonna
Hmm.
come in. We're gonna meet
Hmm.
Paul. We're gonna meet Ringo. Though Ringo isn't the first drummer. Pete Best
Hmm.
is the first
Hmm.
drummer. We're gonna meet eventually. We're gonna meet Brian Epstein. We're gonna meet. Did I mention George? We're gonna meet them all.
Hmm.
They're all gonna
Hmm.
come in slowly, and it's like Avengers assemble until you have
The
John, who's the
Beatles.
bad.
Yeah.
John's the bad boy.
Hmm.
Paul's the good boy.
Hmm.
George is the mysterious one,
Hmm.
and Ringo is the sort of accessible little puppy in the back, even though
Yeah.
he's older.
Yeah. Oh. Oh,
And
really? He's the oldest of them?
I believe Ringo was the oldest.
Interesting.
I
Okay.
think he was older than the other ones. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Um, just an absolute killer's row when you think of like how that could not have been more perfect. The four of them together, the
Hmm.
songwriting
Hmm.
partnership, all of
Hmm.
it. I mean,
Hmm.
there's a reason it worked. All right, so here's a little bit about Paul, and this is going to be a key point here coming up. Ah, the McCartney's house in Forthland Road was only a few minutes' walk from the Springwood estate where John had his secondary and utterly different home, Julia's. Paul was soon introduced to Julia and told of the arrangement whereby John lived with his aunt, even though the mother, whom he clearly adored and who clearly adored him, was only a couple of miles away. Julia was captivated by Paul's angelic charm and full of sympathy for the loss he'd suffered a few months before. Paul had lost his mother to cancer.
Mm.
Poor boy, she would say to John, with what now seems heartbreaking irony. We'll see. He's lost his mother. We must have him around for a meal. Paul, in turn, thought Julia gorgeous and was impressed that she could play banjo, an accomplishment which even his highly musical father did not possess. Julia was always suggesting new numbers for the two of them to learn, mostly standards like Ramona and Those Wedding Bells Are Breaking Up That Old Gang of Mine. That's a hell of a name for a song. Those wedding bells are breaking up that old gang of mine.
Worlds are
Like, whoa.
colliding.
Don't get up roast before. Oh,
Oh, yeah.
nothing changes, dude. Um, yeah, and so those songs would influence Elvis and Little
Mm.
Richard.
Mhm.
or no, those songs were as influential as Elvis or Little Richard. That's the thing
Sure.
about the Beatles too, is they have that, you listen to their whole body of work, it's not just rock and roll. They do these like weird old timey kind of vaudevillian, feels like something from the 19th century as much
Hmm.
as the 20th. And it's very curious. Not a lot of other
Hmm.
bands, did that.
Hmm.
Um, Despite the aching lack of a mother in Paul's life, the modest council house, so you know about council housing, right? It's like state
Mm,
housing, state
yeah.
housing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Where he lived with his cotton salesman father and younger brother seemed to John an enviably uncomplicated place. The result was that he and his guitar spent increasing amounts of time at 24th Lynn Road, where the parental welcome was at first not a great deal warmer than Paul's was at Mimi's. Jim McCartney was too much of a realist to try to ban John from the house, but he gave Paul a warning that was to prove not ill-founded. He'll get you into trouble, son. All right. So let's see. Paul's description. John, because of his upbringing and his unstable family life, had to be hard, witty, always ready for the cover up, ready for the riposte, ready for the sharp little witticism. Whereas,
Mhm.
with my rather comfortable upbringing, a lot of family, lots of people, very northern, cup of tea love, my
Mhm.
surface grew to be easygoing. But we wouldn't have put up with each other had we each only had that surface. I often used to boss him around, and he must have appreciated the hard side in me, or it wouldn't have worked. Conversely, I very much appreciated the soft side in him. John had a lot to guard against, and it formed his personality. He was a very guarded person. I think that was the balance between us. John was caustic and witty out of necessity, and underneath, quite a warm character when you got to know him. I was the opposite, easygoing, friendly, no necessity to be caustic or biting or acerbic, but I could be tough if I needed to be. The partnership, the mix was incredible. We both had submerged qualities that we each saw and knew. We would never have stood each other for all that time if we'd just been one dimensional. And so they're starting to play guitar and teach each other guitar,
Mhm.
and and learn how to learn these standard songs and create probably the greatest songwriting partnership of the 20th century, pop
Yeah.
music to date. Um,
Yeah, for sure.
just in this little council house in Liverpool,
Awesome.
and they're kids, they're teenagers.
Yeah.
Ba- Bouts of playing would be punctuated by listening to the radio or to records, pun making, sex talk, and horseplay. The McCartneys had just acquired a telephone, no small thing for a council house in 1957, which Paul and John would use to make anonymous nuisance calls in funny voices to selected victims like John's former headmaster, Mr. Pobjoy.
Do you
Once
mean
they
there's
tried.
like a proto Beatles Jerky Boys album possibly out there floating around?
Hmm. Yeah, that'd be worth a lot of money.
Would be right if they had even a few of those calls recorded somehow.
I don't know if
Yeah.
I'm going to touch on it out of the book, but there's like one recording of their first, like there's was one pressing of the first thing that they ever laid down, and
Mm,
somebody got their hands on it and had
mm,
it, and
mm.
like that thing is worth, it's worth a lot
Yeah.
of money. Yeah,
Yeah.
there's
Yeah.
only one in existence. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think this is fascinating. Once they tried writing a play together about a
Hmm.
Christ figure named Pilchard, who was to remain enigmatically offstage throughout in the manner of Samuel Beckett's Godot. We couldn't figure out how playwrights did it, Paul remembered. Well, that's good because I can't figure out how to play the Beatles either.
Mhm, mhm.
Did they work it all out and work through the chapters, or did they just write a stream of consciousness like we were doing? Unable to resolve this dilemma, they gave up after page 2. The idea of writing original songs to perform rather than merely recycling other people's was firmly rooted in Paul's mind well before he met John. So he's trying to write his own songs. Um, and at 15 years old, this is presumptuous, right? Like this is like crazy. I'm going to be a songwriter.
Mm,
Um, there's a moment here where Buddy Holly comes along, and one point I have to make about John Lennon is that the glasses weren't a joke. He was nearsighted, and
mm,
when he was younger, he didn't have contact lenses. So
mm,
but he wanted to look. He had to look cool.
mm.
So he would walk around like squinting. Like he would walk around just being nearsighted. But here comes Buddy Holly, and Buddy hits the charts, and now John doesn't have to feel bad about wearing glasses, which he felt would have cast him down among the nerds, drips, weeds, and swats. So now he's being pestered because Buddy Hall has made glasses cool. He's pestering his aunt to get him glasses. So there you go. Um, that winter of 1957 and 58. Now here, I want you to flag this because we got about 10 to 12 years, the Beatles will be done. So we're getting into the next
Mm,
12 years of John Lennon's life. He would
mm.
just barely be 30, or he would be around that age. I have to look it up exactly what age he was in 1970. But I mean, these are
Yeah,
kids.
you've been
These are
30. Yeah.
children still. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the winter of 1957 into 58 brought a stream of further Buddy Holly songs. Oh boy, think it over, maybe baby, and so forth. For John and Paul and their facing armchairs playing guitar, it was the most natural step from playing songs Buddy had written to making up ones he might easily have done. Paul would later describe how they'd sit there strumming Buddy-ish chord sequences, exchanging Buddy-ish hiccups, uh-ho, ah-hey, ah-hey-hey, until inspiration came.
Mm, mm,
People would describe their songwriting as telepathic.
mm,
They
mm.
achieved a level of just communication that I doubt many collaborators ever had.